When the ghost of his past finally returned to haunt Dominic Moretti, it didn't materialize as a phantom in the dark. Instead, it arrived in the relentless, pouring rain, wearing the muddy, worn-out sneakers of a trembling street child. As a man who commanded a sprawling empire of shadows in Chicago, someone whose rivals bled before they even dared to speak his name, Dominic was untouchable. Yet, a desperate tug on his cashmere overcoat and 5 impossible words were all it took to bring him entirely to his knees. "Your wife is alive, mister." Dominic froze, the icy wind suddenly piercing straight through to his soul. His jewel had burned to ashes in a twisted wreck 4 long years ago. He had buried her himself, or so he thought. This is the story of how a single whisper tore his violently constructed world apart. The crystal chandeliers of the Drake Hotel cast a blinding, fractured light over the ballroom, illuminating the forced smiles of Chicago's elite. Politicians, judges, and corporate titans mingled freely with the monsters they publicly condemned. Dominic was the biggest monster in the room. To the public, he was a real estate mogul and a generous philanthropist. To the underworld, he was the head of the Moretti Syndicate, a ruthless operator who had consolidated the city's illicit trade in blood and iron following the tragic murder of his wife. 4 years. It had been 4 years since the car bomb on Lakeshore Drive ripped Jewel away from him. She was the only clean thing in his violently stained life. When the explosion consumed her, it consumed the last shred of his humanity. He had spent the following 48 months painting the streets of Chicago red, hunting down the Romanov family, who he believed had planted the explosive. He eradicated them, every last one. But the vengeance tasted like ash, and the silence in his penthouse remained deafening. He couldn't stand the suffocating air of the gala any longer. Leaving his right-hand man, Silas, to entertain a corrupt alderman, Dominic slipped out the side exit onto the covered terrace of Walton Place. The night was bitter, the November rain slashing against the pavement. He lit a cigarette, the flare of his gold lighter briefly illuminating the heavy drops of water. His security detail stood 20 feet away, silent sentinels in the shadows. "Mister?" The voice was so small, so fragile, it barely cut through the sound of the downpour. Dominic turned slowly, his hand instinctively grazing the cold steel of the Sig Sauer holstered beneath his tuxedo jacket. Standing just beyond the awning, soaked to the bone and shivering violently, was a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 6. Her blonde hair was plastered to her dirt-streaked face, and she was clutching a frayed, oversized flannel jacket around her thin frame. His guards immediately stepped forward, their expressions hardening. "Boss, we'll handle this," one of them, a massive enforcer named Carmine, growled, reaching for the child. "Stop," Dominic commanded. His voice was low, but it carried the absolute weight of his authority. Carmine froze instantly. He stepped out to the edge of the awning. He didn't care about the rain ruining his suit. Something about the stark terror in the girl's wide, blue eyes made his chest tighten. He crouched down to her eye level, tossing his cigarette onto the wet concrete. "Where are your parents, little bird?" he asked, his tone softer than it had been in years. "It's too cold for you to be out here." She didn't answer his question. Instead, she took a hesitant step closer, her small, trembling hand reaching out. She grabbed the lapel of his coat. Her knuckles were white. Are you Dominic?" she whispered, her teeth chattering. Every muscle in his body tensed. A street child shouldn't know his name. "Who sent you?" he asked, the softness vanishing, replaced by a cold, calculating edge. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the towering figures of his guards before locking back onto his. "The lady," she stammered. "The lady with the sad eyes. She gave me a picture of you. She said if the bad men ever came for her, I had to run to the big hotel with the gold doors. I had to find you." "What lady?" he demanded, gripping her small shoulders, perhaps a bit too tightly. The girl flinched, but she stood her ground. She reached into the pocket of her oversized jacket and pulled out a crumpled, water-damaged piece of paper. It was a photograph. He took it from her shaking fingers. The breath was knocked out of his lungs. The world stopped spinning. The rain ceased to make a sound. It was a Polaroid, a picture of him and Jewel on their honeymoon in the Amalfi Coast. It was a private photo, one that had been kept in a silver locket Jewel never took off, the same locket that the coroner said had melted in the inferno of the crash. "Where did you get this?" His voice was a dangerous, jagged rasp. "Your wife is alive, mister," the little girl whispered, the words hitting him with the force of a freight train. "But the bad men, they found us tonight." He didn't think. He reacted. He scooped the child into his arms, standing up with a terrifying suddenness. "Silas!" he roared over his shoulder, his voice echoing off the stone facade of the hotel. Silas burst through the terrace doors a second later, his hand already inside his jacket. "Boss? Lock down the perimeter. Bring the SUV to the front. Now!" he barked, carrying the girl toward the safety of the hotel interior. "And get the doctor to the safe house. This girl needs warm clothes and food. We are going to war." Silas took one look at his face. A face, he later said, looked like it belonged to a dead man who had just clawed his way out of hell, and didn't ask a single question. On it. As they piled into the armored Cadillac Escalade, the girl huddled in a heated blanket on the leather seat, Dominic stared down at the crumpled Polaroid in his hands. The edges were singed. Jewel's beautiful smiling face was smudged with dirt. His wife was alive. The thought was a paradox, a beautiful, agonizing impossibility that threatened to tear his mind apart. If she was alive, where had she been? Why had she hidden from him? And more importantly, who was hunting her now? He looked at the little girl. "What is your name, sweetheart?" "Lily," she whispered. "Okay, Lily," he said, his voice trembling with a rage and a hope so violent he could barely breathe. "Tell me everything." The safe house in the Gold Coast was a fortress disguised as a luxury penthouse. Lily sat at the massive granite kitchen island, dwarfed by the surroundings, hungrily eating a bowl of warm soup. Dr. Aris Blackwood, his personal physician, had examined her, declaring her malnourished and terrified, but physically unharmed. Silas stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the stormy Chicago skyline. He was a man made of sharp angles and cold logic, the perfect counterbalance to Dominic's volatile nature. "She says they lived in a rusted trailer park down in Gary, Indiana," Silas reported, his voice low so as not to spook the child. "A woman named Sarah took her in 2 years ago when Lily's junkie mother overdosed. Sarah worked night shifts at a diner, kept her head down. But tonight, 3 men in unmarked black SUVs kicked the door in. Sarah hid Lily under the floorboards and told her to run to the train station, take the red line to the city, and find the Drake Hotel." "And the photo?" Dominic asked, his eyes never leaving the singed Polaroid resting on the marble counter. "Lily says Sarah kept it in a locked metal box under her bed, opened it only when she thought Lily was asleep. She cried over it." Silas turned to face him, his dark eyes filled with a heavy sorrow. "Dominic, you know what this means." "I know exactly what it means," Dominic growled, pacing the length of the room like a caged tiger. "It means the body we buried at Rose Hill Cemetery 4 years ago wasn't Jewel. The coroner's report was definitive. Silas argued gently. Dental records matched. The DNA from the bone marrow was faked, he snapped, turning on him. Someone paid off the medical examiner. Someone orchestrated a flawless illusion to make me believe my wife was burned beyond recognition, and they did it so perfectly that I tore down the Russian syndicate in a blind rage while the real culprit slipped away in the chaos. Silas's jaw tightened. If that's true, it had to be an inside job. No rival family had the reach to falsify Cook County morgue records and manipulate our own internal security to swap out dental x-rays. Someone in our inner circle helped them. The betrayal tasted metallic on his tongue. He had trusted his lieutenants with his life. He had bled with them. "Get me the files," Dominic ordered. "Everything from the night of the crash. I want the original police reports, the fire department logs, and I want the name of the specific coroner who signed off on Jules' autopsy." "That was Dr. Arthur Penhaligon," Silas recited instantly. "He retired 3 months after the accident, moved to a gated community in Boca Raton, Florida." "Retirement on a civil servant's pension?" Dominic scoffed bitterly. "Find out who deposited money into his offshore accounts. And Silas, have our boys in Miami pay Dr. Penhaligon a visit. Don't kill him, just break enough fingers until he starts singing." He walked over to the kitchen island. Lily had finished her soup and was struggling to keep her eyes open. He sat on the stool next to her. "Lily," he said softly, "the men who came to your trailer tonight, did they have any marks on them? Tattoos? Accents?" She rubbed her tired eyes. "One of them, the big scary one who broke the door. He had a snake. Right here." She pointed to her neck. A green snake eating its own tail. Dominic's blood turned to ice. A green snake eating its own tail. The Ouroboros. It was the mark of the Corsican Brotherhood, a highly secretive, ruthless faction of mercenaries and human traffickers that operated out of the shadows of the eastern seaboard. They didn't involve themselves in Mafia turf wars. They were ghosts, hired only for the most high-stakes disappearances and assassinations. "Why would the Corsicans want my wife?" he murmured to himself. "If she's been hiding for 4 years," Silas interjected, stepping closer. "Maybe she didn't just run from the blast. Maybe she was taken, and maybe she recently escaped." The thought of Jewel, his gentle, brilliant Jewel, in the hands of the Corsicans for years, made a murderous roar build in his chest. If they had touched a single hair on her head. "Silas, assemble the strike teams," Dominic commanded, his voice devoid of any emotion, settling into the cold, calculated frequency of a general going to war. "We're going to Gary, Indiana. I want that trailer park surrounded. I want the ground scoured for footprints, tire tracks, stray shell casings. If the Corsicans took her, they leave a trail. They always leave a trail." "And what if it's a trap, Dominic?" Silas asked, his tone cautious. "What if they let the girl go on purpose to draw you out of the city? You've been untouchable here." He looked down at the Polaroid again. The woman in the photo was smiling, holding a bouquet of lavender, her favorite flower. He remembered the way she smelled, the way she laughed when he tried to cook, the way she made a monster feel like a man. "Then I walk into the trap," he said simply. "I would walk into the fires of hell itself if it meant seeing her face one more time. Get the men ready." The trailer park in Gary, Indiana, was a graveyard of broken dreams and rusting metal. It sat on the edge of a polluted industrial canal, shrouded in a thick, toxic fog that smelled of sulfur and decay. By 3 a.m., his black SUVs had completely locked down the perimeter. 40 heavily armed men from his syndicate flooded the muddy lanes, securing the area. He stepped out of the Escalade, the cold rain having reduced to a miserable drizzle. His tactical boots crunched against the gravel as he walked toward Lot 42, the rusted, single-wide trailer Lily had called home. The front door was completely off its hinges, splintered wood scattered across the small wooden porch. Inside, the scene was one of violent struggle. The cheap furniture was overturned, a lamp was shattered on the linoleum floor, but there was no blood. Jewel had fought, or she had run. He stepped into the cramped, stale air of the trailer. His heart hammered against his ribs, an erratic rhythm of terror and anticipation. He was standing in the space where his wife had supposedly lived for years, breathing the air she breathed. "Spread out! Don't touch anything without bagging it," Silas ordered the men who followed them in. Dominic ignored them, moving silently through the tiny living room and into the narrow hallway. There were 2 bedrooms. The first clearly belonged to Lily. Stuffed animals missing eyes, a small bed with a worn Mickey Mouse blanket. The floorboards in the closet were pried up, exactly where Sarah, Jewel, had hidden the child. He walked into the second bedroom. It was sparse. A twin bed, a single dresser, a small nightstand. He stood in the center of the room, closing his eyes, desperate to feel her presence. And then he caught it. Beneath the overwhelming smell of damp mildew and cheap bleach, there was a faint, almost imperceptible scent. Lavender and vanilla. Jewel's signature perfume. She used to have it custom-made by a boutique in Paris. She wouldn't have had access to it here, which meant she had found a way to recreate it using cheap essential oils. His chest heaved. It was real. She was here. He opened his eyes and approached the dresser. The drawers had been hastily pulled open and rifled through. Clothes were scattered on the floor, faded jeans, oversized sweaters. Nothing like the designer silk she used to wear. He knelt by the bed and pulled out the metal lockbox Lily had described. It had been pried open with a crowbar, its contents emptied. The Corsicans had taken whatever documents or money she had saved. "Dominic!" Silas called out from the living room. "You need to see this!" He walked back out. Silas was standing near the tiny kitchenette, pointing a tactical flashlight at a corkboard mounted on the wall. It was covered in faded grocery receipts and coupon clippings, but pinned to the very center was a map of Chicago. Dominic stepped closer. The map was heavily marked with a red felt-tip pen. But she wasn't mapping escape routes. She was mapping his movements. Circled in red were the locations of his legitimate businesses, the real estate firm, the charity foundation headquarters, the Drake Hotel. And next to each location were dates and times. "She was tracking you," Silas said, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Why? If she was hiding from the people who faked her death, why keep tabs on you? Why not just come home?" "Because she didn't trust me," Dominic whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. He traced the red lines on the map with his gloved finger. "Think about it, Silas. If she survived the explosion and realized someone had planted a bomb in her car, who would she suspect first? In our world, the spouse is always the prime suspect." She woke up, realized someone wanted her dead, and couldn't be sure if it was my enemies or me. Silas paled. "You think Jewel believed you ordered the hit on her?" "It makes perfect sense. She goes underground. She changes her name to Sarah. She adopts a street kid to blend in. And she spends 4 years watching me from the shadows, trying to figure out if the man she married was the monster who tried to kill her." He felt a sickening wave of guilt wash over him. He had been grieving her, while she had been terrified of him. "Boss!" One of the enforcers, a young kid named Tony, rushed into the trailer, holding up a transparent evidence bag. "Found this out back, near the canal bank. Looks like there was a scuffle in the mud. Tire tracks lead away to the highway." He snatched the bag from him. Inside was a piece of torn fabric, heavy black canvas, but attached to the fabric was a silver lapel pin. It was small, discreet, but unmistakable in the harsh light of the flashlights. It was a crest, a double-headed eagle clutched in a gauntlet. Silas swore violently in Italian. "That's not Corsican." "No," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "It's not. It belongs to the Costello Syndicate." The Costellos, his biggest rivals in Chicago. They had maintained a fragile, bleeding truce for 5 years, largely because Dominic had decimated their eastern operations, and they knew a full-blown war would destroy them both. The little girl said the man had a Corsican snake tattoo, Silas pointed out, trying to piece the puzzle together. But they dropped a Costello pin? The Costellos hired the Corsicans, he concluded, the puzzle pieces violently snapping into place. Victor Costello couldn't hit me directly without starting a war he'd lose. So, 4 years ago, he paid the Corsicans to eliminate my wife, knowing it would break me. But they botched it. Jewel survived. When Victor found out recently that she was still alive, he sent his mercenaries to finish the job. He crushed the evidence bag in his fist, the sharp edges of the pin digging through the plastic into his leather glove. Victor Costello had his wife. "Call Lorenzo," Dominic told Silas, referring to his underboss who handled the heavy artillery. "Tell him the truce is officially dead. I want every Costello front in the city burning by sunrise. I want his capos dragged into the streets, and tell him to find Victor's current location. Dominic, a full war right now will bring the feds down on us," Silas warned. "I don't care if it brings the National Guard down on us," he roared, the suppressed rage of 4 years finally detonating. "They took her from me once. I will not let them take her again. We burn Chicago to the ground until I find her." He looked back at the corkboard, at the map she had painstakingly drawn. "Hold on, my love," he thought, staring at the red ink. "I'm coming for you, and heaven help the men who stand in my way." By 4 a.m., the skyline of Chicago was weeping rain, but the streets were about to bleed fire. Dominic sat in the back of the armored Escalade, staring at the drops tracing jagged paths down the tinted glass. The city was a grid of power, money, and secrets, and he had spent the last decade conquering every inch of it. Yet, the only thing that mattered was currently slipping through the dark underbelly of the Midwest, held captive by ghosts. "Target acquired, boss!" Silas's voice crackled over the secure comms. He was in the lead vehicle, 2 blocks ahead. "Frankie the Ox Russo just left the Velvet Room on Rush Street. He's moving south toward the Wacker Drive lower levels, 2 escort vehicles." Frankie Russo was Victor Costello's right-hand enforcer, a brutal, unimaginative thug who handled the Costello Syndicate's wet work. If Victor had hired the Corsican Brotherhood to kidnap Jewel, Frankie would have facilitated the cash drops. "Cut him off in the tunnels," Dominic ordered, his voice a dead, flat calm that always preceded his worst violence. "I don't care about the escorts. Leave them in the street. But bring me Frankie breathing." The subterranean roads of Lower Wacker Drive are a concrete labyrinth, a sunless artery beneath the glittering towers of the city. It was the perfect place for an ambush. As his driver accelerated, plunging them down the concrete ramp into the orange glow of the sodium lights, the trap snapped shut. 2 of his heavy transport trucks, disguised as standard Underworld logistics vehicles to avoid police suspicion, abruptly swerved, blocking all lanes of traffic. Russo's convoy slammed on their brakes. Before the Costello guards could even unholster their weapons, Dominic's tactical teams poured out of the shadows, armed with suppressed MP5 submachine guns. The firefight lasted exactly 42 seconds. The echoing thwip-thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire was drowned out by the roar of the city above. Dominic stepped out of the SUV, the damp, exhaust-choked air filling his lungs. Russo's escort vehicles were riddled with holes. The guards slumped over their steering wheels. Frankie Russo, bleeding from a superficial graze on his temple, was dragged out of his shattered Lincoln Town car and thrown violently to his knees before him. He looked up, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a mixture of defiant rage and sudden, dawning terror. "Moretti," Frankie spat, blood staining his teeth. "You just broke the 5-year truce. Victor is going to rain hell on your operations." Dominic didn't say a word. He simply drew his Sig Sauer, stepped forward, and drove the heavy steel barrel directly into his kneecap. Frankie howled, collapsing onto the greasy concrete, clutching his shattered leg. "Silas," Dominic said, not taking his eyes off the writhing man. "Take him to the Fulton Market meatpacking plant, the one we bought from the Triads last year. Suspend him from the hooks." 20 minutes later, the smell of raw meat and freezing ammonia assaulted his senses. Frankie Russo hung by his wrists from heavy steel chains in the center of a refrigerated locker. His face was a mask of agony and sweat, despite the sub-zero temperature. Dominic took off his tuxedo jacket, rolling up the sleeves of his white dress shirt. "4 years ago, a car bomb went off on Lakeshore Drive," he began, his voice echoing off the frost-covered metal walls. "My wife was supposedly in it. Tonight, I found out she wasn't. I found out the Corsican Brotherhood took her, and I found a Costello Syndicate lapel pin at the scene of her kidnapping in Gary, Indiana." He stepped closer, grabbing Frankie by the jaw, forcing him to look into his eyes. "Where is Victor keeping her?" Frankie coughed, a wet, rattling sound. He looked at Dominic, and to his absolute shock, a dark, bloody smile spread across his lips. "You're a fool, Dominic. A blind, grieving fool." Dominic struck him across the face with the butt of his gun. "Speak." "Victor didn't touch your wife," Frankie gasped, spitting a tooth onto the frost-covered floor. "We dropped that pin in Gary tonight because we were tracking the Corsicans, too. We wanted to know why the ghosts were operating in our territory without paying a toll. We saw them hit that trailer. We saw them take the woman." "Lie to me again, and I'll take your other knee," Dominic whispered. "It's the truth," Frankie screamed, the bravado finally breaking. "Victor has been terrified of you for 4 years. You think he'd risk waking the devil by hitting your wife? We didn't hire the Corsicans, Moretti." He stared at him, his mind racing, calculating every angle. "If Victor didn't hire them, who did?" Frankie let out a dark, breathless laugh. "We intercepted a wire transfer 2 years ago. We were trying to blackmail the Corsicans. We found out who paid them the $10 million to fake the dental records and snatch your wife. The money didn't come from our accounts, Dominic. It came from an offshore shell corporation in the Cayman Islands, a company called Aegis Holdings." The room spun. The freezing air suddenly felt like a physical weight crushing his lungs. He stepped back, dropping his gun to his side. Aegis Holdings. It wasn't a Costello front. It was his. It was a highly classified phantom account used exclusively for paying off federal judges and high-ranking politicians. Only 3 people in the entire world had the biometric clearance and the cryptographic keys to move money out of that account. Him, Silas, and Lorenzo. The silence in the penthouse safehouse was thick enough to choke on. The storm had finally broken outside, giving way to a pale, bruised dawn creeping over Lake Michigan. He stood by the window, a glass of amber bourbon untouched in his hand. "It's him," Silas said quietly, standing by the mahogany desk, his eyes glued to the decrypted financial ledgers glowing on a secure laptop. I routed the transaction history through our contacts at the Vanguard Group to bypass standard banking firewalls. The authorization signature matches Lorenzo's biometric key. He initiated the $10 million wire transfer to the Corsican Brotherhood exactly 3 days before Jules' car exploded. Lorenzo, his underboss, the man he had grown up with on Taylor Street, the boy who had taken a knife to the ribs for him when they were teenagers running numbers for the old neighborhood bosses. He was the godfather to the children Jewel and Dominic had planned to have. Why? The word clawed its way out of Dominic's throat, raw and bleeding. Power, Silas replied, his voice devoid of judgment, presenting only the cold, hard facts of their brutal world. You remember how you were before Jewel, Dominic. You were a conqueror, unstoppable. But when you married her, you started talking about going legitimate. You started funneling syndicate money into real estate and charity. You were dismantling the empire Lorenzo helped you build. He closed his eyes. The memories flooded back. Jewel begging him to walk away. Him promising her he would, slowly, carefully. Lorenzo had always looked at her with a thinly veiled contempt, viewing her not as his wife, but as a fatal weakness. He wanted you broken, Silas continued softly. If he just killed you, the captains would have fractured the family in a civil war. But if he killed your wife, he knew you would go mad. He knew you would launch a suicidal war against the Russians, which you did. He expected you to die in the crossfire. And when you survived and slaughtered them all instead, he just bided his time, playing the loyal soldier, waiting for you to eventually burn out so he could take the throne. A terrifying, absolute calm washed over Dominic. It was the death of Dominic the man, and the total resurrection of Dominic the monster. Set the trap, he commanded. By noon, he called Lorenzo to a private meeting at an abandoned airfield they owned in Rockford, Illinois. He told him over an encrypted line that his interrogators had broken Frankie Russo and that Victor Costello was holding Jewel in a hangar there. He told him to bring his best men, that they were going to war. He arrived an hour early. He sent Silas and his loyal guards away, instructing them to wait a mile down the access road. He wanted to face his betrayer alone. The hangar was a cavernous dome of corrugated steel, echoing with the sound of the wind whipping across the desolate tarmac. He stood in the center, a solitary figure draped in a black trench coat, waiting. 10 minutes later, the heavy metal doors ground open. A black SUV rolled in, its headlights cutting through the dusty gloom. Lorenzo stepped out. He was dressed impeccably, as always, a silver-haired wolf in a bespoke suit. 4 heavily armed men flanked him. "Dom," Lorenzo called out, jogging toward him, a look of manufactured urgency on his face. "Where are they? Where's Jewel? I brought the heavy hitters just like you asked." He stopped 10 feet away when he realized the hangar was completely empty, save for Dominic. His eyes darted to the shadows, his survival instincts suddenly screaming at him. "There's no one here, Enzo," Dominic said, using his childhood nickname. His voice was eerily soft. Lorenzo froze. His right hand twitched toward his coat. "Dom, what is this? Where are the Costellos?" "Frankie Russo was very talkative this morning," he said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "He told me about Aegis Holdings. He told me about the $10 million. The blood drained from Lorenzo's face. The mask of the loyal friend melted away in an instant, replaced by the cornered panic of a traitor. He didn't try to deny it. In their world, denials were for courts, not for kings. "Kill him!" Lorenzo shrieked, diving behind his men. The 4 hitters raised their weapons, but Dominic was already moving. He had anticipated this exact formation. He drew twin suppressed pistols from his coat, firing in a seamless, fluid motion, born of years of violence. The thwip, thwip, thwip echoed rapidly. 3 of the men dropped instantly, shots perfectly placed between their eyes. The 4th managed to fire a wild burst that tore through the sleeve of his coat, grazing his bicep before he put a bullet through his throat. The hangar fell silent again, save for the wet gurgling of the dying men and Lorenzo's ragged breathing. He was scrambling backward on the dusty concrete floor, his own gun forgotten in his panic. Dominic walked over to him, his boots clicking rhythmically against the floor. He kicked his weapon away and stood over him. "She was going to ruin you, Dom," Lorenzo screamed, looking up at him, tears of terror streaming down his face. "She was turning the most feared man in Chicago into a domesticated dog. We built an empire. We bled for it. I did it to save the family." "You did it because you're a coward who wanted a crown you couldn't earn," he replied coldly. He aimed his pistol down at his chest. "Where is she, Lorenzo? Where did the Corsicans take her?" "You shoot me, you'll never find her," he spat. "They move her every year. She's a ghost." He lowered the gun slightly, aiming at his kneecap. He pulled the trigger. Lorenzo's scream tore through the hangar, a sound of absolute, unadulterated agony. He writhed on the floor, clutching his shattered leg, vomiting from the pain. "I have hours, Lorenzo," he whispered, stepping on his wounded leg, pressing down with his boot. "I have days. I will take you apart, piece by piece, and I will keep you alive through all of it. Where is my wife?" Okay, he sobbed, gasping for air, his spirit utterly broken. "Arthur Sterling, the disgraced farmer CEO. He owes the Corsicans money. They use his private compound as a black site. It's on a private island in the middle of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. That's where they took her last night. They're waiting for my orders on what to do with her." Arthur Sterling, a name that carried weight in the upper echelons of corrupt corporate America. It was a fortress. He looked down at the man who had been his brother. "Did she suffer, Enzo? When they took her?" "No," he whimpered, holding his hands up defensively. "I ordered them not to touch her, just to hide her. I swear, Dom, I swear on my mother's grave." "Your mother would spit on you," he said. He raised his gun and put a single bullet through his heart. He didn't stay to watch him bleed out. He turned and walked out of the hangar into the pale daylight. He pulled his phone from his pocket and hit Silas's speed dial. "Get the tactical teams," he said, pressing a hand to his bleeding bicep, ignoring the sting. "We're going to Wisconsin. We have an island to burn. Lake Geneva, in November, is a frozen, desolate expanse of grey water and biting winds." The Sterling estate sat on an isolated 20-acre island in the center of the lake, a sprawling monstrosity of stone and glass surrounded by sheer cliffs and a dense, skeletal forest. It was a billionaire's retreat turned mercenary fortress. At 2 a.m., the water was violently choppy. They approached the island in 3 matte-black Zodiac military boats, running completely dark, their engines muffled. Dominic sat in the bow of the lead boat, fully clad in black tactical gear, a Kevlar vest strapped tightly over his chest, a custom M4 carbine resting in his hands. The icy spray off the lake stung his face, but he felt nothing. His entire existence was narrowed down to a single point, the stone house looming in the darkness ahead. Thermal scans showed 12 hostiles patrolling the perimeter. Silas whispered through the earpiece. He was operating from a mobile command center on the mainland, guiding them via satellite. 8 more inside the main house. They are heavily armed, Dominic. Military-grade hardware. These aren't street thugs. These are Corsican elites. Understood, Dominic replied softly. Snipers. Do you have eyes on the exterior guards? "Affirmative, boss," came the voice of his lead marksman, positioned on a bluff across the water. "Take them out on my mark." The Zodiacs bumped gently against the rocky shoreline of the island's southern cove. They slipped over the sides into the freezing, waist-deep water, wading silently onto the pebble beach. Dominic raised his hand, signaling the 10 men with him to hold. "Mark," he whispered. 4 synchronized, suppressed shots echoed faintly over the wind. Through his night vision goggles, he watched 4 Corsican guards on the terrace above slump to the ground simultaneously. "Move," he ordered. They scaled the stone steps leading up to the estate like shadows. They bypassed the electronic security gates, using encrypted override devices Silas had provided, courtesy of their deep pocket contacts. They stacked up against the heavy oak doors of the rear entrance. He nodded to Carmine, the massive enforcer from the hotel. He planted a localized breaching charge on the hinges. 3, 2, 1. The muffled thump blew the door completely inward. They flooded into the sprawling, dimly lit kitchen. Chaos erupted instantly. A Corsican mercenary rounding the corner raised an automatic shotgun. Dominic fired twice into his center mass before he could pull the trigger, stepping over his body without breaking stride. Sirens began to wail throughout the massive house, bathing the corridors in flashing red light. "Clear room by room!" he shouted over the blaring alarms. "Check your fire! Nobody shoots blindly! She is in this house!" The next 10 minutes were a blur of smoke, muzzle flashes, and blood. The Corsicans fought with brutal efficiency, but his men were driven by something far more potent than a paycheck. They were driven by loyalty, and by the terrifying, unrestrained wrath of their boss. They tore through the opulent living rooms, the library, the grand staircases, leaving a trail of bodies in their wake. He kicked down the door to the master suite, sweeping the room with his rifle. Empty. "Boss," Tony's voice crackled frantically over the comms. "We cleared the upper floors, no sign of the target, but we found a reinforced steel door in the wine cellar. Electronic keypad, heavy deadbolts. It looks like a panic room. I'm on my way." He sprinted back down the marble staircase, sliding past the bodies of his enemies, descending into the subterranean levels of the estate. The wine cellar was massive, lined with thousands of dusty bottles. At the far end, Tony and 2 others were desperately trying to pry open a thick, stainless steel door set into the stone wall. "Step aside," Dominic ordered, pulling a block of C4 from his tactical vest. He molded it directly onto the heavy locking mechanism, inserted a detonator, and stepped back behind an oak wine rack. "Fire in the hole!" The explosion shattered hundreds of bottles, raining vintage red wine across the stone floor like blood. The heavy steel door groaned, buckled, and swung open by a few inches, thick smoke pouring out from the breach. He threw his rifle over his shoulder, drew his pistol, and pushed the heavy door completely open, stepping into the dimly lit room beyond. It was a sterile, windowless cell. A cot, a small table, a single light bulb swinging gently from the ceiling, casting chaotic shadows. And standing in the corner, backed against the wall, was Jewel. His breath caught in his throat. The gun slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the concrete floor. It was her. The blonde hair was longer, wilder. The delicate curves he remembered were gone, replaced by a gaunt, hardened frame. She was wearing a simple grey tracksuit, but the eyes, those fierce, intelligent blue eyes that had captivated him from the moment they met, were exactly the same. She was holding a jagged piece of a broken ceramic mug, wielding it like a knife, her hands trembling violently. She looked terrified, feral, ready to fight to the death. "Jewel," he choked out, his voice cracking, a tear finally escaping and cutting a warm path down his freezing face. He took a step toward her. "Don't come near me," she screamed, her voice hoarse and raw. She pressed her back harder against the wall, waving the ceramic shard at him. "I swear to God, Dominic, I'll cut my own throat before I let you take me back. I won't let you finish the job." The words felt like a physical knife plunging into his chest. She still believed it. After all the blood, all the searching, the woman he loved more than his own soul looked at him and saw her executioner. He slowly dropped to his knees, holding his empty hands up in the air, ignoring the wet stone soaking through his pants. He took off his tactical helmet, throwing it aside, leaving himself completely exposed and vulnerable. "I didn't do it, Jewel," he pleaded, his voice breaking, stripping away every ounce of the Mafia boss, leaving only a broken, desperate husband. "I swear on my life, I didn't order the bomb. I thought you were dead. I buried an empty casket, and I mourned you every single day for 4 years. Please, my love, look at me. Please." Jewel stared at him, her chest heaving, the ceramic shard still gripped tightly in her bleeding hand. The silence in the panic room stretched into an eternity, heavy with the weight of 4 years of lies, trauma, and a love that refused to stay buried. Jewel's hand was shaking so violently that the ceramic shard sliced into her own palm, drops of deep crimson splashing onto the grey concrete. Her breathing was shallow, frantic, like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. She looked at him, searching his face for the lie, for the coldness of the mob boss she had spent 4 years hiding from. But there was no mob boss in that room, just Dominic. Just the man who had bought her lavender ice cream on the Spanish steps in Rome. The man who had promised to shield her from the darkness of his world. 4 years, Jewel whispered, her voice cracking, tears finally spilling over her bruised cheeks. "They told me you ordered it, Dom. The men who took me after the crash. They laughed. They said my husband paid $10 million to have me erased so he wouldn't have to share his throne." "It was Lorenzo," he said, the name tasting like poison. He didn't move an inch from his knees, his hand still raised in complete surrender. "He used my personal shadow accounts. He faked the dental records. He wanted me broken so I would start a war and get myself killed. I swear to you, Jewel, I just killed him myself a few hours ago when I found out." She squeezed her eyes shut, an agonizing sob ripping from her throat. But the shard remained raised. The instinct to survive had been beaten into her for too long. He needed her to know. With deliberate, agonizing slowness, he lowered his right hand and reached down to his ankle. Jewel gasped, taking a step back, raising the jagged ceramic higher. "Wait," he breathed. He unclipped the strap of his ankle holster, pulled out his backup weapon, a small, snub-nosed .38 revolver, and placed it on the floor. He slid it across the cold stone until it rested gently against the toe of her sneaker. "If you truly believe I came here to kill you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, looking up into her terrified blue eyes, "then pick it up. Do it yourself. I won't stop you. Because a life where my wife looks at me like I'm a monster, a life without you in it, isn't a life I want to endure for another second. Pull the trigger, Jewel, or come home." The silence that followed was deafening, save for the distant, muffled wail of alarms upstairs. Jewel looked down at the gun. Then she looked at him, at the blood soaking through his torn sleeve, at the absolute, shattering devastation written across his face. She saw the truth. She saw the grief of a man who had spent 48 months walking through a graveyard of his own making. The ceramic shard slipped from her bloody fingers, shattering into dust on the concrete. She collapsed to her knees, burying her face in her hands, a wail of pure, unadulterated heartbreak, echoing off the stone walls. He lunged forward, closing the distance between them, and gathered her into his arms. He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her tangled, dusty hair, inhaling the faint, lingering scent of lavender and survival. She gripped his tactical vest, her knuckles turning white, crying so hard her entire body convulsed. "I'm sorry," she sobbed into his shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Dom. I was so scared. I escaped their transport truck 2 years ago in Ohio. I ran. I changed my name to Sarah. I found Lily because she was alone, just like me. I thought if I stayed dead, you wouldn't come looking." "You never have to run again," he vowed, kissing the top of her head, tears streaming freely down his own face, mixing with the dirt and blood. "I've got you. The Corsicans are dead. Lorenzo is dead. It's over, my love. It's finally over." He scooped her up into his arms, just as he had done on their wedding night, though she was heartbreakingly lighter now. He carried her out of that suffocating cell, stepping over the ruin and the bodies of the men who had stolen their lives. When they emerged onto the main floor, the estate was burning. Silas stood in the grand foyer, his assault rifle lowered, directing the remaining tactical team members toward the exits. When he saw Dominic carrying Jewel, his cold, stoic facade broke. He let out a breath he looked like he had been holding for 4 years, giving a single respectful nod. "The boats are secured, boss," Silas said quietly. "The local authorities are responding to the explosion, but they are still 20 minutes out. We need to vanish." "Burn the rest of it," Dominic commanded, holding Jewel tighter as she buried her face in his neck, hiding from the carnage. "Leave no trace." They walked out into the freezing, biting wind of the Wisconsin night, the orange glow of the roaring fire painting the dark waters of Lake Geneva. As the Zodiac boat cut through the icy waves, carrying them back to the mainland, Jewel reached out from beneath the heavy thermal blanket he had wrapped her in. She found his hand, her cold, trembling fingers interlacing with his. He squeezed her hand, anchoring her to the present, promising her a future. 48 hours later, the Chicago underworld was unrecognizable. With Lorenzo dead and the truth revealed, Dominic called a sit-down with the remaining captains of the Moretti Syndicate and Victor Costello. He did the unthinkable. He abdicated. He handed the illicit territories, the rackets, and the blood money over to Silas, instructing him to maintain peace with the Costellos. He liquidated his shares in the casinos and the ports, keeping only the legitimate real estate holdings and the charity foundation. The monster who ruled Chicago had finally died, killed not by a rival's bullet, but by the whisper of a little girl in the rain. He walked into the private recovery suite at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. Jewel was sitting up in bed, looking more beautiful than he had ever remembered, the dark circles under her eyes finally beginning to fade. Sitting beside her, coloring in a brand-new drawing book, was Lily. The little girl wore a clean, yellow sundress, her blonde hair brushed and shining. When he walked in, Lily looked up, beaming. "Dominic!" she cheered, dropping her crayons. Jewel smiled, a genuine, breathtaking smile that reached all the way to her blue eyes. She patted the edge of the bed. "Come here, you." He sat down, pulling Lily into a gentle hug before leaning over to kiss his wife. Her lips were warm, tasting of vanilla and hope. The ghosts of the past 4 years, the violence, the betrayal, the suffocating grief, shattered completely in the light of that room. "What are you drawing, little bird?" he asked Lily, looking down at her messy scribbles of a house and 3 stick figures. "Us," Lily said simply, her big blue eyes staring up at him with absolute trust. "Our family." He looked at Jewel, his heart swelling with a profound, quiet peace he hadn't felt since the day he met her. They had walked through the fires of hell, betrayed by those closest to them, hunted by shadows. But they had survived. The rain that washed over Chicago that November night didn't just bring the cold. It washed away the grave of a woman who refused to die, and the violent empire of a man who refused to stop loving her. The criminal underworld moves on, a relentless machine of greed and power. But Dominic Moretti no longer steers its wheels. He traded his crown of shadows for a life in the sun, proving that even the most ruthless monsters can be brought to their knees and completely rebuilt by a single, fragile spark of hope. The scars of betrayal run deep, but the foundation of this new family, Jewel, Lily, and Dominic, is built on a truth that no bomb or bullet could ever shatter.